always without mercy. Not every Roman execution was a long, drawn-out performance. Sometimes, death came quickly, coldly, with nothing but a blade or a push. There are some most brutal punishments Rome used. It was turned into a warning for the whole world to see. Before we get into the story, take a moment to drop your location and local time in the comments. It's always amazing to see where in the world people are tuning in from. Now, back to Rome. Beheading was Rome's version of a clean death. It was often given to Roman citizens, especially those with high social rank, while slaves and outsiders were crucified or torn apart in public arenas. Senators and generals might be given a quieter, quicker end. A kneel, a sword, and silence. It might sound merciful, but it wasn't always. Executioners weren't surgeons. A poorly aimed swing could mean multiple strikes, cracking bone and spraying blood. The idea was speed and dignity, but reality didn't always cooperate. Then there was the cliff, the Tarpeian Rock, a jagged drop on the edge of the Capitoline Hill, overlooking the Roman Forum. This was where traitors were thrown to their deaths. No weapon, no ceremony, just a sudden fall that broke the body and erased the name. The cliff was named after Tarpeia, a Roman girl who once betrayed the city to its enemies. Instead of rewarding her, those enemies crushed her with their shields, and Rome took the lesson to heart. Her name became a symbol of disgrace, and the cliff a place to send others who followed in her footsteps. Being thrown from the Tarpeian Rock wasn't just about killing a traitor, it was about making a point. It was public, it was dramatic, and it sent a clear message to anyone watching. Rome does not forgive betrayal. Compared to the tortures and slow deaths we usually associate with ancient executions, these two methods might seem almost restrained. But in their simplicity, they carried a chilling weight. Beheading took your life. The cliff took your name. That's the Roman way, direct, powerful, and unforgettable. Crucifixion wasn't invented by the Romans. It was borrowed from earlier civilizations, like the Persians and Carthaginians. But Rome took the concept and elevated it into something much more calculated and terrifying. In the Roman system, crucifixion was never random or casual. It was punishment with a message aimed at specific groups: slaves, foreigners, pirates, and disgraced soldiers. Roman citizens were rarely subjected to it unless found guilty of the most extreme crimes. The process began long before the cross. It usually started with scourging. The condemned would be whipped, often with a brutal tool called a flagrum, strips of leather embedded with bone or metal. The whipping tore skin and muscle, often causing massive blood loss before the actual execution even began. This weakened the victim both physically and mentally, and by the time they faced the cross, many were already close to death. Next came the journey to the place of execution. Contrary to common belief, the condemned didn't carry the entire cross. The vertical post, or stipes, was typically fixed in place. What the victim carried was the crossbeam, known as the patibulum. This heavy wooden beam was slung over their shoulders and dragged through the streets, making the procession itself a public spectacle. Onlookers would jeer and mock as the condemned struggled forward, their backs torn open from the scourging. Once at the site, the executioners got to work. The crossbeam was placed on the ground, and the victim was either nailed or tied to it. Nails were usually driven through the wrists, not the palms as is often shown in art, since the palms couldn't support the body's weight. In some cases, ropes were used instead. The arms might be stretched straight or draped over the beam. There was no single, uniform method. Executioners often adjusted the positioning as they saw fit. The beam was then hoisted up and attached to the upright post. The victim's feet were either tied or nailed to the vertical beam. And then came the waiting. Death did not come quickly. The person on the cross suffered from shock, blood loss, dehydration, and exposure to the elements. But the most significant factor was asphyxiation. Hanging from the arms caused the chest muscles to stretch, making it increasingly difficult to breathe. The condemned would push up with their feet to take in air, but every movement brought more pain. Eventually, the body would grow too weak to keep struggling. Breathing slowed, the diaphragm failed, and death came. Sometimes, if executioners or officials wanted to end the suffering more quickly, either out of pity or necessity, they would break the victim's legs. This act, known as crucifixion, made it impossible to push up for air, speeding death by suffocation. After death, the body might be removed, but in many cases it was left on the cross, exposed to scavengers and the elements. The goal was to deny the dignity of burial and make the punishment unforgettable to those who passed by. One of the most well-known crucifixions in history is that of Jesus of Nazareth. His death, recorded in religious texts, became a defining symbol of Christianity. But to the Romans, it was just another criminal, just another warning nailed to wood. Perhaps the most staggering mass crucifixion came in 71 BC. After the Spartacus-led slave revolt was crushed, the Roman general Crassus ordered 6,000 captured rebels to be crucified along the Appian Way. From Capua to Rome, crosses lined the road for miles, a chilling show of force to remind every slave of their place in the empire. It worked. The revolt ended. The message was received. Bodies left to rot on the cross served as grim markers, symbols of absolute control. Birds would circle. Passers-by would look away. The stench would cling to the road for days. And still, no one dared to interfere. Removing a body without permission was considered an act of defiance in itself, punishable by death. The display was the punishment as much as the act of crucifixion itself. Damnatio ad bestias, condemnation to beasts. The roar of the crowd rises before the gates open. Dust hangs in the hot air, shimmering under the midday sun. At the center of the arena, a single man stands, trembling. He is unarmed, or perhaps holding a dull blade, something that offers the illusion of hope. From beneath the trapdoor, a low growl rises. Then silence. A moment later, the beast emerges. This is damnatio ad bestias, the Roman condemnation to beasts. A punishment not just for execution, but for performance. Death wasn't enough. Rome wanted the world to see what happened when you defied it. This was death as entertainment and cruelty as theater. The condemned weren't always the worst of criminals. Some were guilty of serious crimes: murder, treason, blasphemy. Others were political dissidents or prisoners of war. Many were slaves who had resisted or tried to escape. What they had in common was that Rome decided they needed to be made an example of. And no stage was more fitting than the blood-stained sand of the amphitheater. These executions were scheduled as part of public games, often alongside gladiatorial matches and chariot races. The spectators came to be thrilled, horrified, and entertained, to cheer and laugh while men were torn apart by lions or trampled under the feet of elephants. There was no sense of solemnity. This was, after all, a spectacle. Some victims were given a weapon, a shield, or a spear. It gave them a chance, just enough to make the crowd excited. Most of the time, these tools were symbolic. The animals they faced were strong, fast, and had been carefully prepared by professional handlers. These were the bestiarii, animal trainers and tormentors who ensured that the beast would arrive in the arena starving, enraged, and ready to kill. The bestiarii didn't just feed the animals. They manipulated them. Some were whipped. Some were kept in darkness for days. Some were drugged or denied water. All were made desperate, unpredictable, and violent. Others condemned weren't given weapons at all. They were tied to posts or chained to the floor. Some were disguised to resemble mythological figures and reenacted famous stories. Except these actors were real people and the death scenes weren't staged. A man might be dressed as the villain in a Greek legend, only to be torn to pieces by a bear in front of thousands. The crowd would cheer, not because they saw justice, but because they saw drama. The animals used were as varied as they were exotic. Rome's vast empire reached from the forests of Germany to the deserts of Africa, and from these corners came lions. Most likely the now extinct Barbary lion, leopards, tigers, and cheetahs. There were crocodiles from the Nile, bears from the Alps, bulls bred for aggression, wild boars from the forests, and even elephants trained for stomping executions. The more unusual or fearsome the creature, the more excited the crowd became. In many cases, the animals weren't even natural predators of humans. That didn't matter. What mattered was that they could kill, and kill in ways that looked chaotic and horrifying. A lion pouncing, a bull goring, a crocodile dragging a chained man across the floor. These moments were what the crowd came to see. The animals were often kept in underground chambers beneath the Colosseum. Special trapdoors and lifts would allow them to burst into the arena suddenly, adding surprise and tension to the executions. Sometimes they were released all at once, sometimes one by one. If a man managed to survive the first, the next would finish the job. Despite the appearance of randomness, these events were highly organized. Each match had a schedule, and each death was part of a carefully constructed program meant to build momentum and emotion in the audience. In some cases, the crowd had favorites, not of the condemned, but of the animals. A particularly aggressive leopard or a lion that had killed with flair might become a recurring star, cheered by name. There were occasional reversals, rare, unexpected. A prisoner might actually survive, killing the beast and shocking the crowd. In such cases, the editor of the games, the person in charge, had a choice. Show mercy and spare the man, turning him into a legend, or send in another, larger beast. Most chose the latter. These public executions weren't just entertainment. They were deeply political. They reminded Rome's citizens and visitors of the power the empire held over life and death. No one was too small to be punished. No one was too far from the reach of Roman justice. The sheer scale of the spectacle reinforced the glory of Rome while dehumanizing its enemies. But there was a cost. Over time, the endless need for exotic animals led to an ecological disaster. Roman hunters and traders scoured the empire's borders to bring back lions from North Africa, elephants from India, bears from Europe, and countless others. It is estimated that during major festivals, thousands of animals were killed in a single week. And this continued for centuries. Whole species were driven to extinction or near extinction, especially in areas like North Africa, where lions and elephants once roamed freely. The demand for new animals never stopped until the supply did. As the centuries passed, the appetite for these executions began to wane. Christianity began to take root across the empire, and the idea of using death as spectacle grew less acceptable. The games lost popularity. By the late 4th century, the practice of damnatio ad bestias faded, disappearing alongside the last of Rome's great amphitheater events. Still, its memory endured. Even now, the idea of being thrown to the beast remains one of the most chilling punishments in human history. It captured everything about Rome's darkest side: its love of power, its hunger for control, and its belief that terror, when carefully staged, could hold an empire together. The blood in the sand may be gone, the crowd silent, and the animals long extinct, but the echo of those screams, both human and animal, still lingers in the ruins of the Colosseum. Poena Cullei, punishment of the sack. Of all the crimes in ancient Rome, none was considered more vile, more unnatural, or more unforgivable than parricide, the act of killing one's own parent or close relative. To the Roman mind, such a betrayal cut deeper than treason against the state. It wasn't just a crime, it was an offense against the natural order, an abomination that defied the very foundation of family, honor, and civilization. And for a crime so unthinkable, Rome created a punishment just as shocking. Poena Cullei, the punishment of the sack. The process began not in the public arena, nor on a scaffold, but in a quiet and deliberate space where the condemned would hear the details of their fate. Unlike crucifixion or exposure to beasts, this was not designed for spectacle. This was a ritual, dark, symbolic, and deeply rooted in Roman religious and social fears. The criminal would be stripped, tied, and sewn into a large leather sack. But this sack was not empty. In its more infamous form, the culleus also contained 4 terrified animals: a dog, a monkey, a rooster, and a snake. Each creature was chosen not at random, but with symbolic intent. The dog represented loyalty turned rabid. The monkey, chaos and mockery. The rooster, betrayal at dawn. And the snake, treachery at its coldest. Together, these animals formed a chaotic storm of teeth, claws, wings, and scales. As the sack was sewn shut, the panic inside began to build. The animals, trapped and confused, attacked whatever they could reach, including the man condemned to die. Once sealed, the sack was carried to a nearby river or sea and tossed in. It would not float for long. The man inside would drown slowly. As water seeped through the seams, panic would rise. The last sounds he'd hear wouldn't be the calm gurgle of water, but the snarling, screeching violence of the very creatures chosen to mirror the madness of his crime. Death came not only by drowning, but by terror, by biting and scratching, by the suffocating crush of fur, feathers, and scales. But why this punishment? Why not simply behead the killer or hang him from the gallows? The answer lies in the Roman obsession with symbolism. Poena Cullei wasn't just about death, it was about erasure. The parricide wasn't worthy of a public execution or burial. They were to be removed from the human world entirely. No grave, no tombstone, no pyre, just a leather sack at the bottom of the river. And there's more. In Roman tradition, rivers were seen as spiritual boundaries, dividing the world of the living from the dead. By tossing the murderer into the water, the state was not just killing the body, they were casting out the soul. It was a statement that this person no longer belonged to the world of man. He had severed his most sacred bond, family, and would now vanish, punished by nature itself. The first recorded case of this punishment dates back to 101 BCE, when a man named Publius Malleolus was convicted of killing his own mother. Though the use of animals in his case isn't confirmed, the act of sealing him in a sack and casting him into the sea marked the beginning of one of Rome's darkest legal traditions. Over time, the inclusion of animals became more consistent, adding theatrical cruelty to the ritual. Even in Rome, Poena Cullei was rare, not because the Romans were merciful, but because parricide itself was rare. The idea of a child murdering a parent was so taboo, so deeply shocking, that it terrified even the most hardened citizens. The punishment was not designed to be used often. It was designed to exist as a constant threat, a story told to remind every Roman what fate awaited those who broke the ultimate bond. And yet, despite its grotesque nature, the punishment didn't vanish with the fall of the empire. Strangely, it resurfaced during the Middle Ages and even into the early modern era. In 1548, in Germany, a miller who killed his father was sentenced to die by sack. Though only a dog and a cat were included, the symbolism remained. Even centuries after Rome had faded, the shadow of the Culleis still loomed over Europe's justice system. But not every attempt to revive the punishment went smoothly. In one case, the animals escaped the sack during the execution, leaving only a confused man drowning alone. In another, finding the right combination of animals proved nearly impossible. Try catching a snake, a monkey, a rooster, and a dog all at once. And then try keeping them alive long enough to toss them into a river together. The complexity of the act often turned it into a chaotic mess. And over time, the method was slowly phased out in favor of more conventional executions. Still, the legacy remains. Of all Rome's punishments, Poena Cullei stands out. Not for the number of times it was used, but for its symbolism. It wasn't loud like crucifixion. It wasn't public like damnatio ad bestias. It was quiet, confined, and dark. A killer wrapped in leather, forgotten beneath the surface of a river. It shows us something profound about Rome, that their punishments weren't just about causing pain. They were about meaning. The Romans believed that justice had to speak, and sometimes it had to whisper in the cruelest ways imaginable. Even today, the story of the sack lingers. It's been depicted in literature, echoed in horror fiction, and used as a metaphor for betrayal and guilt. When we hear of a crime that seems inhuman, it's Poena Cullei that comes to mind. Not because of its frequency, but because of what it says, that some crimes, in the eyes of ancient Rome, stripped you of the right to exist, to be remembered, or even to die like a man. Down in the riverbed, beneath the quiet flow of water, the sack would settle. The leather would darken. The animals would stop moving. and the last trace of the killer would disappear into silence. The crowds gathered early. The air buzzed with excitement. Merchants sold food and wine just outside the arena walls. Children sat on their fathers' shoulders, eager for the show to begin. For most Romans, it was a festival, a holiday, and a civic duty rolled into one. But for the men and women behind the gates, chained, trembling, and waiting, it was their last day alive. In Rome, death wasn't hidden. It was displayed, celebrated. Arena executions weren't just about justice. They were about performance. The public didn't come simply to see criminals punished. They came to be entertained. Executions were woven seamlessly into the grand spectacles of the amphitheaters. The main events, gladiator battles, and beast hunts, drew tens of thousands of spectators. But in between matches, to fill time and keep the crowd excited, Rome turned death into theater. These weren't quiet hangings or formal beheadings. These were dramatic, bloody, and carefully staged killings, designed to shock, amuse, and remind everyone who ruled the world. Many of the executions were performed in the form of mythological reenactments. The condemned were dressed as characters from well-known stories. Criminals playing the roles of villains, monsters, or failed heroes. But the drama didn't end with acting. These were real deaths disguised as theater. When the Minotaur was slain, it wasn't pretend. When Prometheus was chained to a rock and had his insides torn out, it wasn't special effects. It was a criminal, and it was very real. One infamous tale tells of a man condemned to play the role of Orpheus, the tragic musician from Greek myth. On stage, he strummed a lyre to charm the animals, just as the story goes. But then a bear was released. The animal was not impressed by the performance, and the man was mauled to death in front of a roaring crowd. That was the punchline. That was the entertainment. The Romans called it legions, or theatrical executions. Sometimes the shows were elaborate, with painted scenery, props, and entire stage crews. Other times, the scene was simple: a man tied to a stake, a torch lit, and the screams echoing off marble walls. These spectacles didn't just satisfy the crowd's appetite for blood. They served a political purpose. By placing executions inside public games, the state reminded the people who held the power of life and death. It was propaganda as much as punishment. You didn't just see someone die. You saw what happened to those who defied Rome. The victims weren't always criminals. Many were prisoners of war, slaves, or religious minorities. Early Christians, in particular, were sometimes made to die in these staged spectacles, portrayed as enemies of the gods or accused of defiling Roman tradition. To kill them publicly was to turn them into symbols, warnings carved into the memory of the empire. The crowd played its role too, cheering, laughing, betting on how long someone would survive. Occasionally, the crowd would demand more excitement, and the editor of the games, the person in charge, would order something even bloodier. Public executions became a feedback loop. The more the people wanted, the more the state delivered. For the Romans, this was more than cruelty, it was culture. A well-staged execution demonstrated control, order, and the reach of Roman law. No corner of the empire, no status, no belief could protect someone once they were in the arena. The message was clear: Rome could entertain itself with your death. But these spectacles were also expensive. They required logistics, manpower, and, most critically, victims. As centuries passed, the pool of prisoners shrank. The morality of the empire began to shift, especially with the rise of Christianity. Slowly, the enthusiasm for public executions as theater began to fade. By the late 4th century, as Christianity spread and the games declined, the arena executions became less common. Eventually, they stopped altogether. But for hundreds of years, they had shaped Roman identity: violent, theatrical, and absolute. And even now, the shadow of those blood-stained sands remains. The ruins of the Colosseum still stand, silent and solemn. But if you listen closely, you can almost hear the roar of a crowd and the distant cry of a man playing Orpheus, knowing how his song will end. Rome's arena was never just a place for sport. It was a stage for power, for punishment, and for stories written in blood.